Assalamualaikum, my name is Arfan and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to discuss the Textus Receptus as well as the eclectic text. Textus Receptus basically means the received text, and eclectic text basically means like they've taken passages from different manuscripts and they've actually came out with the Greek New Testament. The Textus Receptus is also somewhat like that, but a lot of people do not know, and they thought that Textus Receptus is like this text traditionally have been there, and it's like a tradition, so on and so forth. But Textus Receptus basically came from Erasmus. Erasmus was looking to produce the Greek New Testament for printing, right? And so when he was looking at different manuscripts, Greek manuscripts, so he has to look at all these different manuscripts and make the decision. And so technically, even the Textus Receptus is also an eclectic text, but the amount of choices or the amount of manuscripts available to Erasmus at that time was not as much as what we have today, about 5,800 Greek manuscripts. Some are repeats because they're the same book, but they're separate. They're in their host or house in different museum. So let's about 5,000, almost 6,000 or so, right, including repeats, including the same manuscripts from the same source. But when Erasmus was trying to do his Greek New Testament, there's only about 100 or so manuscripts, and even so, there's a lot of different variant readings as well. And so Textus Receptus and eclectic texts, I don't see a problem to them, because they're pretty much the same thing, right? Even though they're not the same thing when it comes to the reading of the text, but the methods on how this text came to be, they were the same. Same for the majority text, the so-called Western tradition. Okay, Caesarean used to be inside, but then Metzger removed it actually in the 1960s. Okay, he argued against it. But either way, suppose the Western tradition, the Byzantium text, okay, the majority text. There's also different manuscripts. There's also lots of manuscripts, right? And so, and for some reason, and this is known by scholars and those who actually propose these views, but for some reason they paint a picture as if this is coming straight from the mouth of the disciples of Jesus with no variations. No, there are tons of variations as well in the Byzantium text, in the majority text, so on and so forth. They are all eclectic texts, because in order for them to send to the printer, they have to use different manuscripts. Now, and also scribes in the past, when scribes were copying books, okay, they were also comparing different manuscripts, and they adopted different readings to their manuscripts when scribes were actually copying text or writing text. And we have evidence that scribes actually uses different manuscripts, and they prefer reading from different manuscripts, right? Which is why we have the genealogy of the manuscripts. And so from the very beginning, the New Testament, even before the printing press, with the amount of manuscripts that we have today, right? Even from the very beginning, scribes practice the same eclecticism that scholars today propose or practice, okay, just in a different way, because scholars today have 2,000 years of manuscripts, okay, 1,800, 1,900, suppose 2,000 years of manuscripts to look at, whereas scribes in the 3rd century only have a few manuscripts to look at, okay. And we still find evidence, we have evidence that they actually either they change and create a new reading completely, or they harmonize. Okay, Harmonization of the Gospel, a book by Brill. you should check that out, right? But either way, even if you read the different um, even if you read the different manuscripts, you find that scribes harmonize the gospel, right? And so what does it mean when they harmonize the gospel? Meaning they're literally taking readings from another manuscripts, and then they're introducing it to their manuscripts, right? And so even though this is not the same kind of eclecticism, but technically, if you look at it from that perspective, if you look at it from a perspective whereby scholars are just picking and choosing different readings, right? This is exactly what scribes are doing in the past. They're just picking and choosing different readings, right? But they are not out there to produce a new Greek New Testament. That is the only difference. Okay? Scribes in the past, they are not there to produce a new Greek New Testament, right? And the Nestle-Aland committee, they're out there to produce a new Greek New Testament based on the genealogy of the readings, okay, the best attested to readings, the earliest readings. But scribes in the past are not doing that, okay. But the very fundamental thing that they are both doing, they are doing the same thing, picking and choosing different readings and incorporate them in their own readings. Okay, and this is exactly what the committee, although to a much more bigger extent, okay, in terms of its severity, but they're both doing the same thing. And so the Textus Receptus came from that tradition as well, right? And so people have not have painted a picture differently, because I'm not sure whether they look at it in depth or whether they just want to bash the eclectic text of the Nestle-Aland, and they just want to promote the Textus Receptus or the majority text or the Western text. Yeah. But either way, whenever a text actually goes to a printing press, you have to look at scholars must have looked, or printers must have looked at different manuscripts, because they need to print the text, right? You can't print unless you do today. You have different variant readings, right, or marginal notes and so forth, right? But what does it show? It shows that it is an eclectic text, even though it is not to the extent of the Nestle-Aland, whereby they just pick and choose, anything they find that is earliest and best attested to readings, okay, and produce a new corpus of Greek manuscripts that no one in the past has actually used. Okay, and so this is one of the criticism that the UBS and the NA committee have faced, right, from conservative evangelical. But the argument is from that committee, I'm not representing any one of them, right, is that even the Textus Receptus, even the majority text, even the scribes in the past, okay, they do practice this kind of picking and choosing, okay. And so it depends on how you word it, but the fundamental principle is the same. And so when I heard Christians, some group of Christians saying that, oh, the King James only, the Textus Receptus only is the true word of God, they basically don't know textual criticism, right? They don't know what's going on. And so it is, I give them the benefit of the doubt that they don't actually know the science, quote unquote science, or the art of textual criticism, which ancient scribes also practice, right? Just the methods is not the same, but the very fundamental principle of actually picking and choosing a text, whether for theological reason or for whatever reason it is beyond our purview. We don't care. The very fundamental thing that they do is that they pick and choose text, right? And so it is the same principle. And so when people say that the eclectic text is unholy, so on and so forth, they basically are saying to the very text that they believe in, okay, whether it is the King James or whether it is the NIV, whatever it is, right? Scholars pick and choose different texts, but some actually pick and choose so many in every places that they somehow have produced a new Greek New Testament, right? Whereas in other case, scholars also pick and choose, but they don't market themselves as out there to produce a new Greek New Testament. If you compare all these different manuscripts in the past, each one of them is different, right? Not a single one of them is identical. And shall we say that each one of them is a different Greek New Testament? Because that's what they are, isn't it? If I have two books and they're not the same, they're not identical, meaning this book is different than this, right? So they're not the same Greek New Testament. And so it makes no sense to me for people to argue that the eclectic text is unholy, so on and so forth, bashing the eclectic text, bashing the UBS text, whereas they don't even know the tradition of how their text actually came from. The majority text, the Western text, the Textus Receptus, call you whatever you want. Okay, they all come from the same practice. Just the difference is that one market it as to produce a completely new Greek New Testament, and then the other one doesn't market it as such. But the very idea that goes behind in for them to be able to produce this text, they practice picking and choosing. Right? Today, the NA committee pick and choose texts depending on the earliest Greek manuscripts available, and using methods, although not foolproof, but advanced in methodologies, okay, and techniques, and so forth, and how you perceive, with the inclusion of Christological oriented changes, theologically motivated changes as a criteria, intrinsic evidence, so on and so forth. And also they look at patristic quotations, and so on and so forth. Okay, whereas in the past, the Textus Receptus or majority text, they are using a much later text, especially the Western text, okay, quote unquote Western text. Whereas you know that there's a lot of changes, and also if you study textual criticism, okay, and so even so, that traditions have gone through changes, and they have genealogy. Okay, each manuscript have genealogies which goes back, right? And so if you look at it from that angle, they are also picking and choosing. They're eclectic in a sense, okay, and so they became part of the Textus Receptus, the Byzantium text, the Western tradition, Western text, quote unquote, whatever you want to call it. Every single text that is been produced has some form of eclecticism to it. And so it makes no sense to me for one to argue against the Nestle-Aland. In fact, the Nestle-Aland is actually going back to the earliest manuscripts. Okay, if you look at things from a cohesive, from a holy perspective, okay, if you look at things, let me just bring up here. If you look at the NA28 that I have here, right? If you look at it from a holistic perspective, meaning overall, okay, this is definitely have been pick and choose and so forth. Origen didn't read this text, okay, nor did Eusebius, nor did Jerome, nor did Tertullian in the 2nd century. Okay, they did not read this text, right? But each and every page of the New Testament, all right, we can be assured, okay, to a certain extent, that all these texts actually goes back to the early century, right? And so, which is better to have? To have a book that each and every part of it is made up of the earliest and best attested to manuscripts, or to use the King James, okay, which the very fundamental Greek text behind it is made up of much later manuscripts. Okay, much later manuscripts. So which is better? Which makes more sense? Now, obviously, to me, to have a text that is in every single area early as possible, okay, and using the best attested to manuscripts, okay, using rigorous methods that have been employed, okay, to able to find the earliest readings, which probably people from this area read, people from that area read, and it is much better for me than to have the fundamental, or than to have the underlying text made up of a much later manuscripts, which have gone through different changes and so forth. Okay, and it is also not based on early manuscripts themselves. And so, which is much better? To me, it depends on your perspective, actually, right? But for me, it makes more sense to have as early as a text as possible, right? If we look at things from a historical perspective. But if we look at things from a theological perspective, I understand why people say that King James and so forth, because this is a tradition. The tradition, though not the tradition for the majority of the Christian church, right? This tradition, the Textus Receptus, the received text for printing, is only about 600-700 years old, right? Who knows how much changes have occurred before the Textus Receptus was printed. Although this doesn't make sense, but Textus Receptus basically means after the text was, the received text for the text that people receive. But you get what I mean. I'm talking about the manuscript tradition. Okay. And it has been proven from the Nestle-Aland that the early readings are not found in the Textus Receptus, or whatever you call it, Western traditions or whatever it is. For example, the pericope adultery, Johannine comma, the last Mark 9 to 20 is not in there. The last 11 verses of Mark. Okay, the Son of God in Mark is not there. Okay. And so on and so forth. And so it is much better to have a text page by page, if you want to see it that way, or line by line, or verse by verse, right? To have as an early as a text as possible. Okay. Now, from an entirety perspective, I'm not saying that this is superior. Okay, from an entirety perspective. Okay. Because there are some problems to this as well, and I acknowledge this in my different videos. Okay, there are some problems to this as well. Nothing is perfect. Okay, but there are more problems with the tradition of the Textus Receptus than there are in the eclectic text of the NA28 or the NA family. Okay. And so hopefully this video shed some light into the understanding of how Bible comes from, so on and so forth. And a lot of people do not know, because they do not read or write. They shy away from doing or studying textual criticism, right? And because they are confused easily about all these different methods, intrinsic probability, internal attestations, and all these are different methods, which is very important. This is our guiding principle as to how we actually arrive at our conclusion, right? And so people shy away from textual criticism because, according to conservative, or conservative might view it that way, because they do not want people to mess with the Holy Scripture, right? But the Holy Scripture that they deem, is King James, is not being read by Origen also. Right? The early church fathers did not read the Textus Receptus. And so the same claim, the same argument can be put back towards them. Right? If you want to know what Origen read, go and read what Origen wrote about his quotation. Right? That is what Origen wrote. And what, for example, Bartman has produced in 1985, the text of Origen. Right? Just read the text of Origen, even though majority of the book is in Greek. But you will not. It is not the same. It is not the same. Right? And so, if we have more text from the church fathers, but we have enough text from the church fathers, but you also have to understand that church fathers in Eusebius, in Ephesus, for example, is reading a different text than the church father in Alexandria, right? Because different books were copied differently, right? When scribes copied, they changed the text, they harmonized the text, okay? They introduced scribal errors, right? So on and so forth. So the same gospel that we have in Asia Minor is not the same in Alexandria. There are minor changes, there are major changes, whatever it is, but there are changes. No two Greek manuscripts of the New Testament are the same. Okay, and so when a scribe is copying text, okay, they are producing a new text, even though they might lean more towards certain texts, right? But when they are producing, because scribes produce a lot of majority of this New Testament that we have, okay, manuscripts that we have. Some, for example, in the past, people go to a scribe and, can you please copy for me Gospel of Saint Mark? Okay, they will copy. This is the Gospel of Saint Mark that I have. I want 20 copies. Okay, they will copy. But even in the 20 copy from the same manuscripts that they make, they will contain mistake. Because scribes are not photocopier machines. They will leave out verses, their eyes would skip, homoteleuton, okay, occasioned by paraplepsis. And so all these things will occur. And so if I take, or someone took the 5th copy, okay, and send it to his cousin or whoever it is, probably in Rome, yeah, and then took another copy and send it to someone else in Turkey, for example. Okay, these two manuscripts are not going to be identical, even though they're copied by the same scribes, because scribes make mistake. Scribes are not attentive, and earlier on, scribe took dictation, right? And so some scribes might be sleepy, they will not be able to hear properly, right? The same word, the same alphabet, the same character, the same sound, right? The longer sound and the shorter sound produce a completely different meaning or different word. So scribes might misheard or misinterpret, so on and so forth. And so they just write. They don't care, It's like, because if you look, I'm not saying that they don't care, but if you look, that there are 400,000 different variants, right? 400 different errors, meaning it shows collectively that due care has not been taken. If due care has been taken, then we look at the Jewish tradition, all right? Whereas the Tanakh of the Masoretes, and comparing it to the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? Most of it has been preserved faithfully for the most part. Okay, and so the Jewish scribes actually took much more care than the scribes copying the New Testament. Right? So why is there a difference there? They're both from the Hellenistic world, right? The Qumran community, they live in the Hellenistic world, right? And so if Jews can faithfully copy their Torah, by this I don't only mean the Pentateuch, the whole thing, the Tanakh, Navim Ketuvim, okay? And so if they can faithfully copy the manuscripts for the most part, okay, faithfully copy the manuscripts, why can't Christian scribes early on? Okay, that is a question that I won't have a definite answer, and neither do scholars, because none of those people are alive for us to interview. All right, but we have to look at things from collectively, from a holistically, and see that the Jewish scribes have faithfully copied, for the most part, as a whole, okay, copy their Torah, whereas Christian scribes have made thousands, hundreds of thousands of changes, and these changes have been, discerned by scholars and the ones that produces the Textus Receptus, the same way the Nestle-Aland committee, okay, is doing today. Right? It's the same thing. The same thing in the past, in the 3rd, 4th century, the same thing in the 16th century, the same thing in the 21st century. Right? Scribes are always using their own senses, okay, to actually pick and choose readings. I'm not saying all scribes, because there are manuscripts that actually is quite good, which is why they have been used. Okay. And so it doesn't matter. For example, Constantine von Tischendorf, he leans towards Sinaiticus because he founded it, right? Whether Sinaiticus is early 4th century or an invention of Constantine, that is a question that I don't know, right? Because the dating of Sinaiticus, okay, is only based on paleography. It is not based on testing, chemical testing, radiocarbon dating. It is not based on that, and so we don't know, right? But whatever the case it is, my point is to demonstrate that people pick and choose different manuscripts, irregardless of the period, okay, regardless of the time, regardless of who, whether it is done by a committee or by a single scribe. The fact is that scribes do change the text. And if you think of the Nestle-Aland committee today, they're also scribes. Yeah? If you think of them that way. And they also change the text. Okay, this is Origen didn't read this. John of the 1st century didn't read his work that is in here. That is certain, right? And so, ladies and gentlemen, it makes no sense to me for you to argue for the superiority of the majority text, the Greek text, the Byzantium text, the Western tradition, whatever it is, right? Because all of these manuscripts have gone through changes, right? Whether it is theologically motivated or whether it is Christologically motivated or whatever it is, philosophically motivated, whatever it is, the fact is that the very fundamental texts have been changed, and texts have been pick and choose from different areas, different manuscripts, to produce a Greek New Testament. Okay, whether it is a Textus Receptus, whether it is the whatever we want to call it. Okay, and the Nestle-Aland is just the latest of that tradition. Okay, latest. Okay, why don't people question the NIV committee? The NIV committee came up with their own Greek text. The Net Bible committee. Yeah, I've shown you the Net Bible before. The Net Bible committee pick and choose their own Greek text and then make translation of it, right? And so why only bash the Nestle-Aland Novum Testamentum Graeci and bash the committee? Doesn't make sense to me, right? Why don't you bash Erasmus for picking and choosing different manuscripts, okay, in Switzerland? Right? Why don't you bash all those people, ancient scribes, that actually change the text, right? That later on became your Textus Receptus, right? So the very fact that Textus Receptus is an invention of the Middle Ages, okay, and people are not aware of it. A lot of the arguments that I've seen on YouTube, people actually supporting, promoting the Textus Receptus, the Byzantine text, the Western text, the majority text. I'm not saying that all of these are the same, okay? Different people confuses between them, but they're certainly not the same thing. Okay? By the 18th century, the Textus Receptus have been abolished. Okay, and so we have a different text, so they're not the same. Okay, but I'm just saying people who argue for the King James only, okay, and the Greek text behind it, the Textus Receptus, the received text, okay, they don't know that the argument is actually against themselves, because that is what the tradition is made of, but they're not aware, because they have not engaged with textual criticism, because theologically they deem textual criticism as a science, as an art, as a practice, as an exercise that is unholy in a sense. Okay? And so this is the part whereby human beings have actually left their brain, left their intellect, and accept something completely based on faith. Alright? Whereas I prefer to have both. Okay? And you analyze, and then you make your own decision, right? And so to completely remove intellect and reason and accept faith only, this is a big problem to me. I will never do that. Okay, and I would also never completely remove faith, right? Completely take theology and wrap it in a plastic bag and throw it in the dustbin of time. No, I will never do that as well. But we have to be clear as to which area we are approaching things at. If we are approaching things from a theological perspective, you can involve history as well, right? But although you accept and reject different parts of history, sometimes not based on good argument, because sometimes you just want to fulfill your desire. Okay, that is not the academic way. Okay, that is ingenuine at times. Okay, and sometimes when we look at things from a completely historical perspective, we have to give precedence to the data that we have, even though we disagree with the data. Even no matter how much we disagree with the data, we have to present the data accurately, right? And if we disagree with the data, it is because we disagree out of our own desires, our own nafs, our own inclinations, right? And we have to admit that. But we cannot just fudge with the data and misinterpret the data and present a completely different interpretation of the data just because we want a conclusion that fits our theology. No, we have to give precedence to the text. Let the text actually guide us to our conclusion, right? And if we disagree, we have to admit that we disagree with this, but we have actually presented the sources, the evidence that we have. We present it to the best of our ability, using academic rigor and genuineness, right? And if we disagree with it, we disagree because it goes against our faith, right? And this should not be a difficult thing to accept, right? Because history is not always right, but we should present the data as it is. We should present it as it is. And if we disagree with it, so be it, right? We disagree because we have a different theology, but at least we are genuine enough to actually present the data as it is, even though we disagree with it, right? And so this is something that not a lot of people are actually able to do. And I've read tons of works, and still to this day I can count, using these two hands of mine, the scholars that have actually played by the historical rule, a very strict historical rule. They play by the historical game, right? They actually allow their conclusions to be based on the data, even if it goes against their theology, right? Because they are approaching things strictly from a historical perspective, and they are giving precedence to the data that we have. Out of all the works that I've read, that's probably only about 7 or 8 or 9 scholars that I've read, okay, that actually take this route. The rest will deviate somewhere here and there, just because they want to conform it to their faith. They can't accept the idea that if I give precedence to the data, right, and I really interpret the data based on the first century context, or the context of when this data is actually produced or came from, okay, they somehow have to mess with it a little bit, either by interpretation or by whatever it is. They have different there's a lot of ways that they actually do this, right? And when I read, I just can't help but feeling very disappointed, feeling very upset, because they have messed with the data just so that their conclusion actually conform to the theology, right? Only about 8-9 scholars that I've read in the corpus of books that I've read, amongst the corpus of books that I've read, only about 8 or 9 scholars that actually stuck through to the data that they have, even if the conclusions, and they are willing to make that conclusions that actually goes against their theology. And so I have high respect, because these are the people that actually are genuine, that are actually honest enough. And I wish more authors, more scholars, would, and I wish that the people that I've read, scholars that I've read, would actually take the same route. One very great example, it clearly states in the New Testament, in 2 Gospels, that Jesus was born. Okay, Jesus was born from a woman. And yet, in an academic book, this scholar can conclude that Jesus was pre-existent. Now, even though the historical rule is that we should give precedence to Mark and the Synoptics, John is a much later gospel. No, but these scholars ignore the Synoptics, right? They say that John is first, but never provide an argument for it. Right? They just simply quote that tradition, but you need to prove that the tradition is correct as well, right? Why are you rejecting clear-cut historical data that suggests the synoptics were earlier, and then just base your faith, just accept John based on faith, whereas you are writing an academic paper using historical methods? And so these are the sort of peculiarities and I face planted when I came across literatures like this, right? You cannot just assume that John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote John, the Gospel of John. You need to prove, right? You need to prove it instead of just assuming, right? Especially when you're writing books about the gospel, right? And recently, I just came across a book arguing against the Q source and actually proposing a different theory, right? But simply, this scholar just say, I assume that this is correct, but then never provides an argument for the assumption, but then have the nerve to actually rebuke the Q tradition, but never actually provide an argument as to why the other theory is actually correct. And so it doesn't make sense to me. Right? And this book is published by Oxford, by the way, Oxford University Press. And so it doesn't make sense to me. Right? If you're trying to refute a different idea, you should present as to why your idea is superior, right? As to why your idea is correct. You can't just simply assume that your idea is correct and then refute the other idea. Whereas the Q gospel theory, the two-source theory, is followed by majority of the scholars. And your idea is unique to a few scholars. And you can't just assume and never provide an argument for it. So I'm baffled. Seriously, I'm baffled. I'm really, really stunned and surprised. And this is published by Oxford University Press. So I'm shocked. I'm in disarray. I can't believe it. That this is the amount of academic rigor that modern scholars are actually producing. If you read books produced by scholars in the 90s, 80s, early 2000s even, you can really see that their academic knowledge is very, 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 they are of a high caliber. Scholars that exist, that started writing around the 60s, 70s, 80s, right? You can see that the academic rigor is there. Whereas if you read works by up-and-coming scholars, new scholars, started writing about past decade or so, their methods and their argument put forward, their level of knowledge, obviously they're all smarter than me, right? But because I've read literatures that was produced in the past, and I've also read literatures that are produced about the past decade or so, like I can really see the difference in terms of knowledge of the people of the past and the knowledge of the academics of today. The academics of today are not able to provide an argument that can even challenge the academic of the past without messing with the evidence a little bit here and there, without presupposing, without actually providing an argument for it. What do they presuppose? What do they assume? And most of the time the argument only comes from one source. I'm not sure if that is what they only want to stick to, but then again, your argument should be brought from different sources. It should be brought from a textual critical perspective, from a genre critical perspective, from all these from a historical social what is it called, the social life, the social historical background of it, right? And also political plays a little bit sense as well, right? But instead of bringing arguments from these different areas which will really strengthen one's thesis, they just brought in argument from a single channel and then just kick away all these people with the past opinions, whereas they have not even adequately addressed the argument proposed by the people writing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s. And so, based on my observation, based on the literatures that I've read, and comparing scholars of the past and comparing scholars of today, the academic rigor of today is not on par with the academic rigor of the people that actually write in the 80s, 90s, right? And so one of the ways that people today is that they introduce new methods, they change the different methods, so on and so forth, and they try to present things from a different angle, okay, whereas they're not really dealing with the argument, right? And so I'm not convinced, and I'm actually quite disappointed actually, right? Because a lot of people today would claim that our past scholars actually got it wrong. They see things from that light. No doubt they were, right? But in the mid 20th in the mid 20th century, okay, the 1900s, around 1950s, 1960s, I think those were the period whereby academic rigor and integrity was actually there, because there's not a lot of distraction. There's no PlayStation, there's no TV, there's no games to play, and so people just sit there and read books. And so today there's a lot of distraction, and I know scholars that actually like to travel during their off season and that. So we don't have a lot of research scholars that are really dedicated to spending their entire life actually reading literatures, because now they have distractions. They have TV, they have YouTube, they have social media. They want to engage in refuting other people. So I don't know. This is just some of the things that I've noticed, right? And so, by the way, I came from an academic institution, right? So I'm exposed to scholars all the time, so I know, right? I'm not just making this up. All my life I work in an academic institution, right? And so I can see people with PhDs, what are they doing? They're playing games during their break times, and so forth. They're not really engaging with literatures, right? They don't spend time in the libraries anymore. They spend time in the middle of in front of their computer at their desk, all these different streaming apps, Periscope, and all these different things. So they're not actually filling up their brains with like necessary knowledge that actually help them to expand their fields. In fact, they're doing other things. No, I mean, I'm not saying that you should be like the people of the past, right? Because I think if the people of the past had games and so forth, they would actually do it. But thank goodness they don't have, because then they are able to produce the literatures that I enjoy reading most of the time, right? But with that being said, there are also prominent new scholars that actually, take things to the next level, right? And so those are the scholars that I really want to engage with by reading their literatures and see what they actually say. And these are the groups of people that actually define their methods clearly, outline their methods clearly, and they outline their presupposition, they outline their assumptions, and they even provide argument as to why they think this is so. Not necessarily full lengthy argument, right? But at least they include this, whether in the footnotes or whether in the endnotes, at least, or even in the text itself, they actually include this. Okay, and so there's only a few of them actually today. By few, I mean obviously there's a lot. I'm not engaged with every single one of the scholars of today's writings, right? But based on what I read, this is all based on the experience that I have. And so, which is why today we have people that are also second grade scholars that actually make YouTube videos. They actually argue for the majority text, argue for the Textus Receptus and bashing the Nestle-Aland text. Whereas they never actually define their methods. They don't even know the how the Textus Receptus was actually produced. Okay? They don't even know textual criticism to a certain extent, because they're not textual critics, right? But you should at least engage with the arguments that are being put by textual critics out there. You should read their works, right? And if you do not want to engage with complete works of textual critics, you can actually engage with, by reading something like this from Brill, right? These are just essays. So this is by SBL, Society of Biblical Literature, right? And you should read studies of textual criticism. You should read scribal harmonization. You should read the criticism of the methods, the coherent-based genealogical method. You should also keep up with CBGM, like Wasserman. Okay, Wasserman is his name. I'm not making fun. All right, Wasserman. Right, and Peter J. Gurry's magisterial work of actually, critiquing CBGM and what scholars actually saying about CBGM. Right, and you should know the different methods of how scholars classify manuscripts, so on and so forth, and then engage your argument from there. Try to use these methods to actually refute the very proponents of these methods, right? We don't see, at least in the literatures that I'm reading, I don't see that. I just see more on assumption based, whereas people are not really engaging, and sometimes they misrepresent because they don't understand the argument, or they deliberately misrepresent. I think the former is much more better way to put it. All right, assuming people would not misrepresent based out of their own desires, based on ill intentions and so forth. But people should engage with textual criticism, even though you're not scholar of textual criticism, right? For me, I engage with all these different fields within the study of Judeo-Christianity because I enjoy them. Right? I'm very passionate, I'm very enthusiastic, because I want to know what's going on. Right? And I told this before, it all comes from a single verse in the Quran, though it occurred multiple times. But the Quran says that the scripture of the Jews and the Christians have been changed. So I want to know what have been changed, and I want to know why people say this changed and so forth. So I want to engage with it. Right? This is at least my hobby, my interest, and I enjoy it. And I think I'll be doing it for the rest of my life. And I'll never be a scholar. I'll never be a scholar. And I don't think I'll ever be one. But at least I want to engage with these materials. I want to read them. Right? If Peter Wasserman or Peter J. Gurry and Tommy Wasserman produce a book, I want to read what they wrote. Right? Because they're the scholar of textual criticism today, right? And so I want to engage with their works, and I want to know what they have to say, because they're brilliant people. They're brilliant. They're smart ass. And so if I can have their knowledge, and how can I have their knowledge, right? I can't just we can't just Bluetooth transfer, right? So by reading their works, you actually get a piece of their knowledge, right? And if you take a piece of this scholar's knowledge, a piece here, a piece there, a piece everywhere, suddenly you have a lot of pieces, right? Though you'll never be as brilliant as these scholars, right? Because some of them are just gifted, though they actually work really hard, right? But they are just gifted, so-called gifted, but they actually work hard. Okay, let's just use the idiom gifted. They're gifted scholars. They're gifted writers. They are able to explain okay, to lay people like me. They are able to explain and they are able to engage. They made us think. They make me think, you know. And so these are the type of intellectuals that is actually interesting to read, right? Whereas you read scholars, some scholars are very, very good at what they do, but when you ask them to explain to you, they can't explain to you, right? But that is a different skill entirely. You know, they're able to write, but they use so many technical jargons and so forth. Okay, and they are not actually writing for laymen like me. They are writing for scholars, right? But even those literatures I want to engage. If you read them once, you don't understand. You read them 20 times, and you'll definitely understand a little bit. Right? If you want to understand more, you read 50 times. Right? And so that is how you should engage. You know the Ehrman's textbook. You know, some chapters I've read more than 10 times. Right? Just to soak it in. Right? And by reading the book the whole way through, that doesn't mean you have Ehrman's knowledge. By reading Ehrman's book, and I've read tons of them, it doesn't mean you get Ehrman's knowledge. And so if you have to read multiple times, you have to engage with them. By engage with them, meaning you don't just read a book once and then throw it in the shelf. This you're not reading a fiction. You are reading a non-fiction. And non-fiction, you can't just read all the way through, like a story, like a novel. No, right? Go by topics of research. For example, the reason I have multiple books of the same subject is because I want to know what different scholars are saying, right? And I have evangelical works as well, because I want to know what they are saying, right? And if I can agree with them, I'll agree with them. And if I can't agree with them, because the evidence from the other scholars are more convincing, then I'll take the opinions that are more convincing, right? That is how a layman should be. A layman shouldn't just reject here, reject there, but couldn't even produce a counter argument, right? In fact, a layman like myself, my method is that I always look at both sides, okay? And which are the sides that makes more sense to me based on the historical evidence, based on the data that is being presented. Okay? I'll take the opinion that makes more sense to me, that actually gives due respect to the sources that was being used, instead of accepting the opinions that are based more on assumption, right? And if people are talking about the gospel, the main thing for me is, how do you prove that the literature you are engaging with is actually correct? Has there been any changes, interpolations, and so forth, right? And so to determine the very source itself, we have to go to textual criticism. Then much later on, you can apply the historical methods: genre criticism, thematic criticism, reductionist criticism, or whatever it is, whatever criticism you want. These are all different methods that actually applies to the text. But first, to establish that this is actually an authentic source, we must apply textual criticism first, right? So this is the fundamental, the basis, because if it doesn't pass through the test of textual criticism, then there's no point arguing about the authenticity of the narrative that we're actually reading. There's no point going to historical argument, historiography, and actually trying to prove that John 1:1 was actually written by John, the son of Zebedee. Whereas the very textual criticism itself demonstrates that John, the son of Zebedee, did not write this source that you were actually trying to argue or trying to base your opinion, right? So most of the time people assume that the very source that they are using is actually authentic. And this is wrong. You have to prove why this source is authentic first, right? So going back to our topic of this video, you have to prove why the Textus Receptus is more authentic than the Nestle-Aland. Right? The reason that I'm defending Nestle-Aland so much is because this is actually rigorous in its methodology. Right? I'm not saying that there's no problem to this, right? But at least I knew that what I'm reading here, at least a single phrase by phrase, not collectively, single phrase by phrase, it actually comes from the best attested to manuscript, and it comes from the earliest source that we have, not manuscripts. I'm talking about the source. Okay, perhaps I should explain this. What do I mean by this? So when you look at manuscripts, right? For example, I have two manuscripts here. Let's just suppose these are two different Greek manuscripts. Okay, two different Greek manuscripts. Manuscript A, manuscript B, and there's another manuscript C. Okay, manuscript C. Okay, manuscript A, okay, is probably 3rd century. Okay, let's just assume this is 3rd century, just a way of illustration. Manuscript C is 11th century. Okay, and manuscript B is let's just call it 4th century. Okay, suppose we do not have manuscript A, we have manuscript C. Okay, that is what did I say, just 11th century. Okay, and we have manuscript B that is 4th century, right? These are physical manuscript. Okay, this was written in the 4th century, this was written in the 11th century, right? But the very text that is found in this manuscript, okay, is a copy of the 3rd century text from manuscript A. Okay, and so what does this shows? This shows that a manuscript can be produced in the 11th century but contains a much earlier reading than a manuscript that was produced from the 4th century. Okay, under the assumption that this was produced in the 4th century, because in the New Testament area, textual criticism, even this is based on much earlier tradition, right? Because scribes do not came up with the text. Okay, the autographers actually came up with the text, but we do not have the autographs, right? And so presumably that this is actually autograph of probably, no text of the New Testament is from the 4th century. Okay, but suppose that, just as a way of illustration, okay, the autograph of the 4th century, okay, complete autograph of the New Testament from the 4th century, although it contains different readings here and there of earlier tradition. Okay. Although that illustration doesn't really make sense in the New Testament if you really look at it from a New Testament perspective, but just to give you an illustration, so a manuscript can be copied by scribe in the 11th century, okay, but the very text that they are copying comes from the 3rd century. Okay, whereas a scribe copying a manuscript that is produced, so many scribe in the 4th century copy this text, okay, but based on a manuscript that is produced in the 4th century also, okay, probably 2 or 3 decades earlier, right? So just by looking at things this way, even though every manuscript goes back, they have a genealogy. Okay, it goes back all the way to the autographs, as far as we can tell, right? But we do not know, because there's so many changes, we do not know which is actually the correct reading. Yeah. But my point is that a manuscript can be produced in the 11th century, but the text that was copied, that contains in the manuscript, it could come from the 3rd century or even earlier. Okay. So not necessarily that we should discard manuscript from the 11th century, okay, because the very script that they have, okay, comes from the 3rd century. Perhaps let me just turn to Mark here and see what I can say. in the manuscripts 2542, okay, occurs a lot of times. Okay, 2542 occurs a lot of times. Okay, the dating, if we look at the Nestle-Aland, if I can just turn to the back where it has the dating. Okay, manuscripts 2542. Oops, I'm at the wrong page. Just give me a second here. I can really demonstrate this better. Okay, manuscript 2542. Let me just find it for you. Okay. The date for it is the 13th century. The manuscripts 2542, St. Petersburg, is currently in St. Petersburg. Okay, and it contains the text of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, following that tradition. So majority of the Matthew, Mark, and Luke is made out of 2542 manuscripts 2542, which dates to the 13th century. Okay. Why are scholars using 13th century manuscripts? Right, says here 2542. Okay. Why are scholars using manuscripts this late? Okay. So for people who don't know, like textual family genealogy of manuscripts and so forth, they'll say, see, this is not early, this is from the 13th century. So the Nestle-Aland contains 13th century texts, whereas they don't know that these 13th century manuscripts contains reading that is Vaticanus, that comes from the Vaticanus tradition. Okay, and so Vaticanus is the 4th century. In fact, it is one of our best attested to manuscripts. Okay. And so the readings in 2542 follows mostly of Vaticanus. So it comes from a genealogy that is strong. So it makes sense to use 2542 in the eclectic text, even though the manuscript is produced in the 13th century, meaning it comes from the 13th century. The physical, but the readings contained in it, the wordings, okay, has a very strong Vaticanus tradition. Okay. And so this is what I meant. So this is some of the critiques that have been put forward against the Nestle-Aland, whereas these people misunderstood how the methods actually work. Right? You can have manuscripts in the, I suppose I can go online and copy Sinaiticus or Vaticanus or Bizet, right? And I can present it to the Nestle-Aland committee, and it will still if they will still use my manuscript, because I am copying directly from Vaticanus. Right? So we're not talking about a physical thing, we're talking about the wording, the very text in itself. Which is why it is called textual criticism, not manuscript criticism. Okay? Because we are critiquing the text where it comes from. We don't care when it is copied. It is copied in the 21st century, it is copied 10 million years later, but if it is copied from an earlier source, directly from an earlier source, or from a tradition, a family, okay, that is, we can establish the genealogy that goes back to the earlier source. Okay. It doesn't matter which era that manuscript is produced, because we only care about the readings. Alright? And so people misunderstood, and they proposed that some of these manuscripts 2542 came from the 18th century, so on and so forth. We don't care when the manuscripts were produced. Alright? We don't care. We care whether the text itself, is it based on an early source. If it's based on an early source and can be proven, we can use the manuscript, no problem. Right? So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope my video makes sense, and I'll see you on my next one. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.